Hello and welcome to Let the Bird Fly, a podcast about living freely in a world given back to us. This is Wade here in my office. We're not doing these in the podcast studio. In my office because Jason's office is disgusting. It's very dirty. There's papers all over his desk.
There really aren't.
Sometimes
many,
stuff on the like a jacket on the sitting area where a colleague or a student might sit. The background is a mix of, I would say, depressing or cluttered. Like that's the two in between.
Gotcha. Cluttered and depressing.
Yeah. So we're here. We have chosen. We've elected.
Yeah. There we go.
To record in my office, which you might notice is very organized and I would say almost beautiful.
Yes. Not at all depressing.
Welcoming. And we're going to be talking then in this video. This is a short video, so we're gonna give you the short and sweet view of this, which is, I would argue, Jason, the way it should always be, because the Bible keeps it short and sweet. We're going to be talking about election, or I would say a word I don't use as much, but that can be used, predestination.
Mm-hmm.
What do you use more, Jason?
I would say election is usually the word that I will use in talking about it,
predestination, we get into like destiny, you get the fatalism, whatever, or if people hear predestination, they think John Calvin and double predestination, and we'll get to what that is. But we're going to talk about the word election. What does it mean that God elects people? This is not in the American setting or in the really any democratic nation. You hear election and you think choosing a candidate, and you're going to look at that candidate and you're going to scrutinize that candidate and you're going to say, do I agree with their views? Do they seem to have good character? Or you're going to say, at least they're not as bad as so and so. They're less likely to press the nuclear button and cause the apocalypse. And so here, when we're talking about election, we're talking about God choosing us. And I say us because when you hear the word election, you might think, well, has he chosen me? And election is always preached as God has chosen you. He has chosen us. Election is tied to the gospel. God has elected us right before we were even a twinkle in our parents' eyes, and yet he elects us through the means of grace. That's how our election is made known when it's proclaimed to us. And that's not because God has scrutinized us and he agrees with our views and he thinks we have good character. It's actually quite the opposite. God elects sinners. He finds the unlovable and he chooses them and he makes them lovable. The dead and he makes them alive. And here, Jason, maybe I can throw it to you. This is meant to be used for the comfort of Christians. I challenge anyone to read the Bible and find the doctrine of election not being used to some degree for the comforting of Christians, unless we're taking it out of context. You get Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, and some will take that to mean eternal election when we're talking about the birthright there. Paul's using an example to illustrate his point on election. But maybe I can throw it to you, where and how does this doctrine sometimes go sideways for people?
Sure, yeah, I think so. Again, you're right on when you said it comes from this idea of election, comes from the idea of choice. And so people start, and we're talking about how God is choosing, before the creation of the world, right? Not just before we're a twinkle in our parents'
before
eye,
I could do anything.
Yeah, right. So this is completely apart from me and my existence here. But people then automatically want to ask, well, if God chooses some, then what about the others? And does that mean he didn't choose them? Does that mean did they do something? Is it God's problem? Is it their problem? And so you really start wrestling with the others side of the conversation and wanting to talk about that question, which really is a separate question. And the way the Bible talks about election is always in terms of God's people, the believers. And I think, as you're saying, it's meant to be an underscoring of the comfort and the certainty that is there.
It's attached to the gospel.
Yes, attached.
We don't
to the
talk
gospel.
about election divorced from the gospel or from God's promise to someone.
Yeah, in fact, in German, they connect the word grace right to election, right? It's always the election of grace, or the gracious election, right? That's talked about there. So, which, those tricky Germans, they have some good ways of talking about some of those theological concepts, and this idea of connecting election, connecting this gracious choice of God to the gospel, to an act of grace, is you can't say the word there without being reminded of that. And I think that's an important thing for everyone to keep in mind, that when you're talking in this term of election, there are lots of questions that often will jump to mind, but the biggest thing that should be kept in mind is that connection to the gospel, that connection to grace, which then leads to assertions of certainty and comfort.
And so in the Lutheran tradition, and in the Lutheran tradition of the former churches of the Synodical Conference, or the churches of the former Synodical Conference, election becomes a big debate more than once. Luther writes on the Bondage of the Will against Erasmus on election, precisely because Luther is defending the gospel, that our salvation is entirely God's work. And in the American setting, C.F.W. Walther and the Synodical Conference will have to defend this position as well, that election is purely God's gracious calling. Luther's defending. Here's just briefly where if you get election wrong, you lose certainty. And so there's two directions people tend to go. God elects just entirely kind of arbitrarily. We emphasize the sovereignty of God. If you're ever reading a book and sovereignty gets mentioned more than grace or mercy, it's probably coming from a Reformed angle. And John Calvin teaches double predestination. And so election becomes uncertain because God in his sovereignty has chosen some, not others. How do I know? Well, I can't know for sure. I can only look at the fruits or the evidence. And we'll get some Calvinist upset by breaking it down this way, but practically speaking, it's how it plays out in piety.
And maybe, to be fair, to John Calvin himself, I think he would have maybe stopped short.
Right. Well, and he calls this a terrible or horrible doctrine, that if you dwell on it too much.
But those that followed him, they went all in on that idea.
Right. Especially Bates. On the flip side, you'll get people who react within Protestantism to that, called Arminians. And America loves Arminianism, right? And they say, well, God is loving. We can't believe that he would just choose randomly people, so we must choose. We make the decision. And this is where American decision theology comes from, which is so popular here because we love decisions. You can't go to an American grocery store and just be like, I'm going to get a can of peas, and there's one kind of can of peas. There's 18 brands, which probably all come from the same factory, but they have different labels, and we choose, right?
Because you might save 4 cents on this can versus the other can.
Yeah, and or one has like a better marketing, like a label thing.
There's a big jolly green guy on it or something.
Yeah, and Arminianism ends up then not so different from probably, I would say, the most common Roman position. Because you have faith and works intermingled, you're going to end up around Erasmus. To be fair, Erasmus doesn't go that far. But why are both of these uncertain? Well, I lose certainty if it's just God arbitrarily, and I can't know his will, his decision. And it's arbitrary if it's my choice. This is why you'll have people making multiple decisions for Christ, sometimes even getting rebaptized, because did I really mean it the first time? And where Lutheran theology wants to end up, because it's where we're convinced the Bible ends up, not just because we're somehow like doing theology from a standpoint of we don't want to be nervous or anxious. Few people can do anxiety as well as we made Kierkegaard. Beat that, right?
Right.
But is that election is for certainty. It's entirely in God, and it's in God's gracious will,
Yes.
his merciful will, and it's revealed to us in Christ. It's proclaimed to us in the means of grace. So if you ever find yourself looking at the doctrine of election and really nervous, and it's causing you an anxiety, and you're wondering, am I elect? You're doing it wrong. Go find yourself a preacher. Go hear the gospel. Go be absolved, and know that God in that word makes Christians. Christians he has elected before time. And so look to Christ and know you have a gracious and merciful God who elects people in grace and mercy. I'll let you wrap it up, Jason, but does that sound fair?
Yeah, I think that sounds real fair, and that idea of, that's comforting, that certainty, because God has hunted you down with those means of grace, right? And he wants you to hear them, wants you to believe them.
He's
and
let the world continue to this day for that purpose.
Yeah, for you. So yeah, focus on the certainty, focus on the grace and gospel, and that's really where you need to be.
Yeah. And if you have free time, if you're bored, feel free in the comments to speculate if Jason is elect,
right? Yeah.
or I am. I like to think it's 50-50. It can only be one.
It's a coin flip, right?
Yeah.
That's it. Who's got the heads, who's got the tails. So.
Yeah. But if you ever find yourself seriously thinking that way, and you're looking at the world, who's elect, who's not, who's the reprobate, who's a step back and realize that's not how the Christian is called to look at the world. Look at the world through the lens of the atonement, who is one for whom Christ died, and that's all. And then give them that same word that proclaims the grace and mercy of God, who before time has chosen sinners to be his saints. I would say, and that is I would say it's almost a good way to let the bird fly.